a voice from 2,000 years ago, nearly forgotten, not in grand temple rituals, but in the small corners of daily life. In a newly found Dead Sea Scroll fragment, we hear family disputes, shared meals, fears of leaving home. This isn't the cold religious sect we thought we knew. It's a community of people, parents, children, scribes writing about their lives. But who were they, and why did their story disappear? Scientists use AI, DNA, and imaging to piece together their world. They discover a lost society whose legacy is only now being heard. The question looms, why were they erased? And what does finally hearing them change about our understanding of early biblical history? This is their story. The community history forgot. The exhibit opens with something unexpected. A glass case holds a small fragment. Brown, weathered, ancient. But the words displayed beside it stop people in their tracks. "My daughter," it says, "our harvest. When we gather for the meal." These are not the words people expect from Dead Sea Scrolls. They came expecting religious laws, ancient prophecies, dense theological debates. But this is different. This is personal. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in caves near the Dead Sea starting in 1947. For decades, scholars studied them. They revealed ancient biblical texts, religious writings, community rules for a group most believed were Essenes. The Essenes were a strict religious sect. They lived apart from society, followed rigid rules, copied sacred texts. That was the story everyone learned, but this fragment doesn't match. It speaks of family, of daily life, of ordinary moments. Therefore, scholars begin to question whether there was more than one group living in these caves. The curator of the new exhibit stands before the case. She explains what makes this fragment so unusual. "We always thought we knew who wrote these scrolls," she says. "A community of men, religious, isolated, celibate. But this text mentions daughters, harvests, families gathering. Therefore, something doesn't add up." The exhibit team started digging deeper, not just into texts, into the caves themselves, into the artifacts left behind, things previous researchers had ignored. They found domestic pottery near the caves, not just storage jars, but cooking pots, small bowls, the kind families use for meals. They found textile fragments, not just ritual garments, but everyday clothes, children's sizes, women's weaving tools. They found hearth remains, places where people cooked, warmed themselves, lived. But previous researchers dismissed these findings. They called them incidental, unimportant, not worth studying closely. Therefore, the new team decided to look again. They examined everything with fresh eyes. Modern technology, new questions. They stopped assuming they knew who these people were, and patterns emerged. The caves weren't just libraries. They were homes, seasonal shelters, places where real people lived real lives. One archaeologist points to a stone bench built into a cave wall. "Someone sat here," she says quietly, "ate here, slept here, raised children here." The fragment continues, its words reconstructed carefully by scholars. Some parts are clear, others damaged, but enough survives to paint a picture. "Some say we should move," one line reads. Others say stay. This is a debate, a disagreement within a community, real people arguing about real decisions. But no historical record mentions this group. No ancient writer describes a community matching these details. Therefore, the viewers face a mystery. Who were these people? Why did they write so personally? And why did history forget them completely? The curator returns to the fragment. She reads the translation slowly. "Do not forget us in the caves where we wrote." The words hit hard, simple, direct, human. These weren't distant religious figures. They were people who feared being forgotten, people who wanted to be remembered. And they were right to worry, because for 2,000 years, no one knew they existed. The exhibit designer explains his vision. He wanted visitors to feel the humanity of these writers, to see them as neighbours, as family members, as real people facing real problems. We put away the idea of ancient holy men in caves, he says, and we asked, what if they were more like us? Therefore, the exhibit focuses on daily life, personal struggles, family relationships, the things that make people human across time. A small display shows reconstructed meals, foods they would have eaten, dates, olives, bread, wine, simple things, ordinary things. Another display shows textile patterns, weaving techniques, clothing styles, the work of hands that cared about beauty, about comfort, about family. But the central question remains unanswered. If this was a real community of families, where did they come from? How did they live? And what happened to them? The fragment offers hints, but only hints. The rest was lost to time, to weather, to the centuries of sand and wind that eroded the caves. A young researcher studies the fragment under magnification. She points to a word, barely visible, almost destroyed. Here, she says, this word might be a name, a place, or a person, but the damage makes it impossible to know for sure. Therefore, as researchers study these fragments, they realize something profound. They aren't just reading ancient texts. They're pulling on threads that upend everything we thought we knew about who lived in these caves and wrote these words and disappeared. 3 experts sit in a research lab, Dead Sea Scroll fragments spread before them. They disagree about almost everything. The first is a paleogeneticist. She studies ancient DNA. The second is a Dead Sea Scroll scholar. He knows every fragment by heart. The third is an archaeologist. She excavates the caves. This is just an outlier, the scroll scholar says. One unusual fragment doesn't rewrite everything. But the paleogeneticist shakes her head. Look at the DNA data, she says. Cave sediment shows families, children, women, animals. Therefore, the argument intensifies. The archaeologist spreads photos across the table, cave layouts, artifact locations, hearth patterns. These caves were lived in, she says, regularly, by groups. The scholar crosses his arms. He built his career on the Essene theory, a celibate community of men, isolated, religious. That's what the evidence has always shown. But the evidence is changing. New technology reveals things previous generations couldn't see. AI compares handwriting across thousands of fragments, looking for patterns, finding connections. The AI specialist explains how it works. The computer analyzes each letter, each stroke, each tiny variation in how a scribe forms words. We're finding multiple scribal hands, she says, hands that don't match the known Essene scripts. But that raises a troubling question. If these aren't Essene scribes, who are they? Therefore, the possibility of a distinct scribal identity emerges. The team reviews artifacts collected from the caves, items catalogued decades ago, filed away, labelled as generic or indeterminate. But they look different now, with new questions, new context. Pottery shows agricultural styles, from farming regions, not desert communities. The clay composition matches valleys, places where people grew crops, raised families, lived settled lives. Textile fragments reveal family weaving. Patterns passed down through generations, work done in homes, not monasteries. Seal impressions show personal marks, family symbols, individual names. But these names don't appear in any Qumran community list. Therefore, the team realizes they're looking at a self-governing community, maybe family-led, definitely different from what they expected. The paleogeneticist presents her findings, cave sediment samples analysed for ancient DNA. The results are striking. We found DNA from children, she says. Multiple women, families. The room goes quiet. This clashes completely with traditional beliefs. The Essenes were supposedly celibate, male only, strictly religious. But the DNA doesn't lie. Children lived here, the scientist continues. Women lived here. This was a community of families. Therefore, the narrative of who lived in these caves must be completely rethought. The scroll scholar sits back, processing. His entire framework challenged by science he can't dismiss. If this is true, he says slowly, then we've misunderstood these texts for 70 years. The lead researcher nods. This is not a purely religious order, it's a community of families who happen to preserve sacred texts. But this challenges decades of consensus, published books, academic reputations, entire careers. Therefore, the team realizes they're not just reconstructing texts. They're reconstructing a social group, an entire way of life, a lost community. The AI continues analyzing handwriting, comparing fragments from different caves, different time periods. The results appear on screen. Multiple distinct hands. Some write formal texts. Others write personal notes. Some copy scripture carefully. Others jot quick messages. We are seeing scribes we didn't know existed, the AI specialist says. But linking them to a known historical group proves impossible. No ancient source describes a community matching this profile. Therefore, the team must hypothesize, build theories, reconstruct carefully from fragments. The archaeologist returns to the caves with new equipment, new questions. She maps everything precisely. Hearths, stone benches, storage areas, sleeping platforms. Previous maps missed the domestic layout, she explains. They saw what they expected, religious storage, manuscript libraries. But the caves tell a different story. They were living spaces, seasonal homes, places where families spent months, maybe years, raising children, sharing meals, writing texts. The scroll scholar examines the personal fragment again, reading the translation carefully. Some say we should move, he reads aloud. Others say stay. This suggests internal conflict, a community debate, real disagreement about the future. But no external historical source mentions this dispute. Therefore, the fragment gives a rare window, an insider's view of community life, decision-making, crisis. The lead researcher addresses the camera, her voice steady, determined. We are reconstructing an entire community, she says, a people whom history forgot. But proving it definitively will require more than fragments. Therefore, as the science converges, a startling hypothesis forms. These might be people completely unknown to history, lost until now. The AI comparison intensifies. The computer identifies multiple scribal hands from different fragments, different caves. The pattern is undeniable. At least 12 distinct writers contributed to these texts, but linking them to a known group becomes impossible. The database includes every documented sect from this period: Essenes, Pharisees, Sadducees, Zealots. None match the profile emerging from the data. Therefore, the team must hypothesize about unknown sectarian scribes. Scholars begin reconstructing the damaged texts, filling in missing lines, using context clues, linguistic patterns, related fragments. One reconstructed passage references seasonal migration. When we leave our field, it reads, when we gather at the appointed place. But the words are ambiguous. Field could mean farmland or gathering place. The appointed place might be religious or simply practical. Therefore, multiple interpretations remain possible. Each scholar brings their own lens, their own assumptions. The debates grow heated, passionate. This suggests agricultural life, one argues. A farming community. No, another counters. It's metaphorical, spiritual farming, but the artifact evidence supports the literal interpretation. Seal impressions examined under new imaging show personal names, family marks, the kind used by heads of households, not communal religious symbols. These aren't monastery seals, the archaeologist explains. These are family identifiers. But these names don't appear in any catalogued Qumran list. Therefore, they suggest a self-governing community. Independent, distinct. The archaeological team returns to the caves, this time with spatial analysis tools, 3D mapping, environmental sensors. They map every hearth, every bench, every possible sleeping platform. The pattern becomes clear. These caves were organised like homes, family units, shared cooking areas, private sleeping spaces. Look at this layout, the lead archaeologist says. This is domestic architecture, not monastic cells. But previous excavation maps failed to note these details. They looked for religious structures, found what they expected, ignored the rest. Therefore, the caves were not just libraries, they were living spaces, homes. Another fragment emerges from careful reconstruction. This one more troubling, more personal. Some say we should move, it reads. Others want to stay. The children are afraid. This is internal conflict, real disagreement within the community, a power struggle or survival debate. The fragment doesn't make clear which. But no external historical reference mentions this dispute. Therefore, the text provides a rare insider window into real community life, real crisis, real fear. The scroll scholar reads the line again and again. The children are afraid, he repeats. This is a parent writing about their kids, about danger. The words carry weight, emotion, urgency. These aren't abstract theological debates. This is someone worried about their family, uncertain about the future, scared. The camera shows the actual fragment under magnification. The ink, the scratches, the weathered surface, every mark made by human hands, hands that shook while writing, hands that held children, hands that worked, lived, feared. A young linguist examines the verb tenses, the word choices, the emotional tone. This is crisis writing, she explains. Urgent, immediate, not careful composition. Therefore, this fragment was written during an actual emergency, not reflecting on past events, but living through present danger. The team debates what kind of danger: military threat, environmental disaster, internal split. The text doesn't say. The damage hides crucial context, but the fear is clear, undeniable. Our caves were home, another reconstructed line says. Not just storage, not just hiding, home. The archaeologist nods. This matches her findings exactly. These weren't temporary shelters. These were residences, seasonal maybe, but real, lived in, loved. The pottery analysis confirms it. Cooking pots show repeated use. Wear patterns from actual cooking, not just storage. Some pots have repairs, ancient patches. Someone valued these vessels enough to fix them, not discard them. You don't repair a pot unless you need it, the archaeologist says. Unless you're living here, cooking here, surviving here. Therefore, every line of evidence points the same direction. A real community, living in these caves, writing these texts, facing crisis. But who were they? The scroll scholar admits defeat. I don't know, he says. They don't match anything in our records. The lead researcher faces the camera. We're looking at an unknown community, lost to history. But the more they reconstruct, the clearer it becomes. This was a community on the brink. Of what? Destruction? Migration? Dissolution? The fragments hold clues, but not answers. Not yet. The team works faster, racing to reconstruct more, understand more. Before the story slips away again, some mainstream Dead Sea Scroll experts push back hard. There's no proof this was a separate sect, one writes in an academic journal. These are outlier fragments, anomalies, nothing more. But the AI handwriting analysis won't be dismissed. Neither will the DNA evidence or the domestic artifacts. Therefore, a public academic debate intensifies. Conferences become battlegrounds. Papers attack papers. Reputations hang in balance. The old guard defends decades of scholarship. The new team presents undeniable science. A linguistic expert flies in to help. She specializes in ancient family structure, kinship terms, household language. She studies the reconstructed phrases carefully. "Our dwelling," she reads. "My wife's son. When we flee." Her eyes widen. "These terms are rarely in sectarian texts," she explains. Sectarian writing uses collective language. We as a group. Our as a community. But this is different. This uses family language. My wife. That's personal, specific, individual. Therefore, the text may reflect a unique community narrative, not religious sect writing, but family record keeping. The material culture analysis continues. Pottery styles compared across regions. The results surprise everyone. The clay composition ties to nearby agricultural valleys, not desert areas. These pots came from farming regions, places where people grew crops, raised animals, lived settled lives. But earlier, scholars only associated desert caves with ascetic communities, the archaeologist explains. Therefore, this group may have been more mobile, moving between valley farms and cave shelters, a hybrid lifestyle, not purely desert dwellers, not purely villagers, something in between. The DNA analysis produces another surprise. Cave sediment samples show mixed ancestry, local populations, non-sectarian families, integration. This is not isolated genetics, the paleogeneticist reports. This shows mixing, intermarriage, social connection. But this undermines the notion of isolated zealots, separated from society, living apart. Therefore, this lost community might have bridged boundaries between sect and society, between religious devotion and ordinary life. A reconstruction video shows how they might have lived, farming in valleys during growing season, retreating to caves during conflicts, writing in both locations, preserving texts, recording family events, not monks, not hermits, families. The lead researcher sits for an interview, her conviction clear, her evidence solid. "I believe we've reconstructed an entire vanished community," she says. "Not just a sect, a people. But proving it definitively may require more than fragments." The camera shows the limitations, damaged texts, missing sections, unclear words, every conclusion tentative, probable but not certain. Therefore, the narrative stakes become existential, about identity, memory, erasure. If they don't prove this community existed, history will forget them, again, forever. The scroll scholar who initially resisted now studies the evidence obsessively. He's changed his mind. The data convinced him. "I spent 40 years believing one story," he admits. "But science doesn't care about my career. It cares about truth." He points to a linguistic pattern he discovered, a phrase used in multiple fragments. "Our names," it says repeatedly. "Remember our names." This phrase appears in personal texts, in marginal notes, in hastily written lines. "They knew," he says quietly. "They knew they might be forgotten, and they were begging future generations to remember." The weight of that realization sits heavy in the room. These people saw their own disappearance coming, wrote desperately, hoping someone would find them. And for 2,000 years, no one did. A young researcher wipes tears from her eyes. "This is a people, not a projection," she says. The DNA specialist adds, Our DNA is their footprint, physical proof they existed, lived, loved, raised children. Therefore, the team decides to go public. Share their findings, risk criticism, risk failure. But staying silent means letting this community disappear again. The press conference is scheduled. The exhibit opening planned. Media invited. Scholars warned. Everyone knows what's coming. Controversy, debate, attacks, but also possibility, hope, memory. The night before the announcement, the lead researcher walks through the exhibit, looking at the displays, the fragments under glass, the reconstructed texts. She stops at the main fragment, the one that started everything. "My daughter," it says, "do not forget us." She makes a promise to whoever wrote those words, wherever they are now. "We won't," she whispers. "We won't forget." But questions remain. If they were indeed a distinct community, why did they disappear? What happened to them? And what was their fate? The reconstructed texts reveal something darker, words suggesting fear, danger, urgency. "They come close," one line reads. "We will scatter. Our names lost." But the fragment is fragmentary, damaged, incomplete. Therefore, the team debates how literal these fears were: persecution, exile, or metaphorical spiritual struggle. The evidence doesn't give clear answers. Some scholars argue for literal reading, real external threat, military or religious persecution forcing them to flee. Others suggest internal crisis, community splitting over doctrine or leadership. The text could support either interpretation or both. But one thing is certain: these people felt threatened, afraid, uncertain about survival. The archaeologists returned to the caves, a second excavation, more careful than the first, looking for evidence of departure. They find traces of hurriedly abandoned items, a loom left half-finished, thread still in place, pottery broken mid-use, tools dropped. "This looks like sudden departure," the lead archaeologist says, but no mass burial nearby, no evidence of violence, no weapons, no bones showing trauma. Therefore, their disappearance may have been gradual, not massacre, not battle, but slow dissolution. Maybe families leaving one by one, migrating, assimilating into nearby towns, the community fracturing over time. The genetic data gets revisited, more sophisticated analysis, better technology. The results show something troubling. Human DNA markers drop off dramatically after a certain stratigraphic layer, a specific time period. But is this due to abandonment or just sampling bias, limited data? Therefore, the mystery of why they left remains unresolved. The team runs AI-driven family reconstruction, using handwriting similarities, seal impression matches, linguistic patterns. The computer hypothesizes family units, parents and children writing in the same caves, teaching each other, sharing scribal work. One analysis suggests 3 generations in a single cave: grandmother, mother, daughter, all writing, all preserving texts. But some scholars argue this is speculative, too much inference from limited data. Therefore, it's risky, compelling but uncertain. The last letters of a disappearing people, or wishful thinking by researchers desperate for narrative closure? One researcher reflects on the emotional weight. "If we fail to preserve their story, they truly vanish," she says. The camera shows her exhaustion, the pressure, the responsibility. But funding runs low. Academic politics interfere. Physical fragments are limited, damaged. Therefore, there's a race against time. Digitize everything. Translate everything. Exhibit everything. Before the story slips into oblivion, a preservation specialist works carefully, scanning each fragment, multiple wavelengths, creating digital archives, backups of backups, Some of these fragments are deteriorating, she explains. We might be the last generation who can read them. That reality weighs heavily. These texts survived 2,000 years, but might not survive another 100. Therefore, every scan matters, every photograph, every digital file. Another fragment emerges from reconstruction, more personal than the others. When we leave, it says, take the scrolls, take the records, let them know we were here. This is explicit instruction, a command to preserve, to remember. They knew they were leaving, knew their community was ending, and wanted evidence to survive. The scroll scholar reads it aloud, his voice breaking. Their final letters, he says. These are their final letters. The team sits in silence, processing, feeling the weight of 2,000 years collapse into this moment. These people wrote to future generations, to us, begging to be remembered. And we almost didn't listen, almost missed them completely. A researcher speaks up. We are racing time against deterioration, against academic resistance, against forgetting. Therefore, the pressure mounts. Everything hinges on whether this community's story will survive beyond the fragments. The exhibit must succeed, must convince people, must make this community real again. But doubt creeps in. What if they're wrong? What if this is all speculation? What if the fragments mean something else entirely? The lead researcher addresses the team. We present what we know, what we can prove, what the evidence shows. But she adds, we also admit uncertainty, where data ends, where theory begins. This is honest scholarship, not claiming absolute truth, but following evidence carefully, respectfully. The fragments sit under museum lights, waiting for the exhibit to open, waiting for people to read them, hear them, remember them. As pressure mounts, everything hinges on one question. Will this community's story survive beyond the fragments, or disappear again into silence? The day of synthesis arrives. AI analysis, DNA results, linguistic studies, artifact reports, everything comes together in one presentation. The team gathers in a conference room, data projected on every wall. The lead researcher speaks. We have a coherent hypothesis, a mobile, family-based scriptural community that coexisted with known sects. But she adds immediately, it's still partly speculative. We must be honest about that. Therefore, the team must present their case compellingly, but cautiously. Science demands both confidence and humility. The evidence summary appears on screen, point by point, documented, verified. AI handwriting analysis, 12 distinct scribes, none matching known Essene patterns. DNA analysis, families present, women, children, multiple generations. Artifact analysis, domestic pottery, family textiles, personal seals. Linguistic analysis, family language, crisis vocabulary, migration references. Spatial analysis, cave layouts showing domestic use, living spaces. Each line of evidence independent, but all pointing the same direction. Therefore, the convergence suggests reality, not coincidence, not error. Reality. The public presentation begins, museum galleries filled, media cameras ready, academic critics sitting in front rows. The curator opens. Today we present a story lost for 2 millennia, a community erased from history. She clicks to the first display, the personal fragment, the one that started everything. My daughter, she reads, do not forget us. The room quiets immediately. Something about those words, their simplicity, their humanity. The presentation continues, each finding explained, each conclusion supported, each limitation acknowledged. When the DNA results appear, gasps ripple through the audience, visual representations showing family structures, children, multi-generational habitation. This was not a monastery, the paleogeneticist says. This was a neighbourhood. But academic skeptics remain. One stands during Q&A. "How can you claim a distinct community from fragmentary evidence?" he demands. The lead researcher responds calmly, "We don't claim certainty, we present probability, the convergence of multiple independent lines of evidence." Therefore, the presentation is both triumph and provocation. Success and challenge. The emotional highlight comes next. A dramatic reading from the reconstructed text. An actor steps forward, voice trained, emotional but controlled. The lights dim. A single spot illuminates the actor. When they come, he reads slowly, "We will scatter like dust, but our words remain. In caves where we wrote, where we lived, where we loved." Pause. "Remember our names. Remember we were here." Another pause. Longer. "My daughter asks why we must leave. I have no answer. Only hope that someday someone will find these words, will know we existed." The fragment ends. Incomplete, missing the final lines. Therefore, the performance is both moving and incomplete. A metaphor for their vanished lives. Several audience members wipe tears. Even critics sit quietly, affected despite themselves. The presentation continues. The researchers propose a working name for the community, based on seal impressions, linguistic markers in the texts. "We call them the keepers," the lead researcher says, "because they kept texts, kept records, kept family histories, kept memory." But she emphasizes, this is theoretical, not definitive, a label for convenience. Therefore, the audience must accept a blended fact and informed reconstruction. The final message comes, cathartic, powerful. "Even though they disappeared," the curator says, "their voices remain. Modern science gives them a second life." Images flash across the screen, the fragments, the caves, the artifacts, the reconstructed family units. "We cannot know their final fate," she admits. "Assimilation, migration, gradual dissolution. The evidence doesn't tell us." But she adds, "Their legacy is preserved through their writing. This exhibit ensures they will not be forgotten. Therefore, their voices are saved, amplified, given new life." The presentation ends. Silence holds for 3 seconds. Then applause, sustained, emotional. Even some critics clap, reluctantly, moved despite their doubts. The exhibit opens immediately after. Visitors flow through galleries, reading, looking, connecting. One elderly woman stops at the main fragment, reads it 3 times. "I felt like I met them," she whispers to her companion. A young scholar takes furious notes, already planning his dissertation. New questions, new research directions. A child asks her father, "Did they have kids like me?" "Yes," he answers, "just like you." Therefore, the exhibit plants seeds of empathy, of connection, of memory. Their story, once lost, is now part of our heritage. But what do we do with this knowledge? The weeks after the exhibit opening bring unexpected responses. Visitors return multiple times, bringing family, friends, students. The galleries stay full. People linger, read every word, study every artifact. One visitor writes in the comment book, "I came skeptical. I left believing, not in religious terms, but in their humanity." Another writes, "Thank you for giving them voices." But not everyone agrees with the reconstruction. Academic journals publish critiques, some fair, some harsh. The debate continues in conferences, online forums, university seminars. Therefore, controversy persists. But the exhibit planted seeds of doubt in old certainties, of possibility in new interpretations. Other researchers begin revisiting their assumptions about sectarian diversity, community structure, family life in ancient religious movements. New excavations are planned at other cave sites, using the same multidisciplinary approach: AI analysis, DNA sampling. careful artifact study, but publishing peer-reviewed results takes time, years. Therefore, the hypothesis will evolve, change, improve, but it will endure. The digital preservation team works continuously, scanning every fragment in the collection, not just the famous ones, every piece, every scrap, high-resolution imaging, multiple wavelengths, 3D models, everything archived, backed up, made accessible online. Future scholars will have tools we can't imagine, the preservation specialist says. They'll see things we missed. But some fragments are too fragile, too damaged, already crumbling. Therefore, part of their legacy will always be tentative, incomplete, lost. The lead researcher gives interviews, explaining carefully, honestly, not claiming more than the evidence shows. We've given them a voice, she says, but we haven't solved every mystery. She's asked about the biggest remaining question. What happened to them? She answers immediately. Where did they go? Did families assimilate into nearby towns? Did they migrate elsewhere? Were they forced out or leave voluntarily? The fragments don't say. The archaeology doesn't tell. The DNA trail goes cold. Therefore, some mysteries remain, forever. But that's okay. That's real. That's honest scholarship. A documentary film crew arrives, wanting to tell the story, reach broader audiences. The team cooperates, carefully, making sure the science stays accurate. The film airs 6 months later. Millions watch. Social media explodes with discussion. Some people see confirmation of faith. Others see historical correction. Still others just see humanity reaching across time. All valid responses, all meaningful. The scroll scholar who initially resisted the theory writes a new book, revising his life's work, incorporating new evidence. Science changed my mind, he writes in the introduction, and I'm grateful. His honesty inspires younger scholars, shows them how real research works, how intellectual courage means admitting error. The exhibit becomes permanent, expanded, new fragments added as they're analysed. Therefore, the site gains recognition. Schools bring students. Tour groups include it in itineraries. The lost community becomes known. A moral reflection emerges about memory, about whose voices get preserved, whose stories get told. The curator speaks at a symposium. How many other communities vanished? She asks. How many voices did we lose? How many do we continue to lose? The question resonates. Beyond archaeology, beyond ancient history. This becomes a call to care for forgotten peoples, to preserve endangered languages, to document threatened cultures. Therefore, the exhibit becomes more than science. It becomes ethics. Digital archives go online, free access. Anyone can examine the fragments, read the translations, study the evidence. Classrooms use the materials. Students around the world encounter the keepers, learn about evidence-based reconstruction, about uncertainty in scholarship, about human connection across millennia. One teacher reports, "My students were moved. Some cried. They'd never felt history as real before." That impact matters, maybe more than academic debates. The final gallery in the exhibit features a reconstructed line, large, projected on the wall. We were here, in the dust, yet still speak. Visitors photograph it, share it. The words go viral, become a meme, an inspiration. But their departure is final in time. They left the caves 2,000 years ago. Their community dissolved, their names forgotten. Therefore, their survival depends on us, on preservation, on memory, on care. A closing video shows the caves, empty now, silent, wind blowing through, sand shifting. But voiceover reminds viewers, these caves held life, love, fear, hope, families who wrote to us across time. Pause. They asked us to remember, and now we do. The exhibit ends there, the final words hanging, resonating. Visitors leave quietly, thoughtfully, changed. Some visit the gift shop, others head straight to the library, wanting to learn more, to keep the connection alive. The keepers are lost, but not gone, forgotten for 2 millennia, but found now. To listen is to bring them home.